She appeared in his room without a word, carrying only a suitcase and secrets, but what she left behind changed everything. David had been living in apartment 4B for exactly 3 months when his life completely changed. The building was one of those old places where you could hear everything. Footsteps above, doors slamming below, and the occasional argument through paper-thin walls. He'd gotten used to it all, even found comfort in the predictable sounds of his neighbors going about their daily routines. The elderly woman in 5B always shuffled around at exactly 6 in the morning, making her coffee and listening to old radio shows. The college kids next door threw parties every Friday night, and by now David knew their entire playlist by heart. It was a strange kind of community, people living inches apart but never really talking to each other. That Tuesday evening in late October felt different from the moment David walked through his front door. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, and dark clouds had been gathering all afternoon. He'd spent the day running around the city, meeting with potential clients who either wanted to pay him half of what his work was worth or didn't understand what graphic design actually meant. His bank account was getting dangerously low. The freelance life looked glamorous from the outside. Work from home, be your own boss, creative freedom. But the reality was constant stress about where the next paycheck would come from. His roommate Jake had moved out 2 months ago to live with his girlfriend, leaving David to cover the full rent on his own. By 11 that night, David was hunched over his laptop at the small kitchen table, working on a logo design that should have been finished 2 days ago. His neck ached, his eyes burned from staring at the screen, and he was surviving on his 4th cup of coffee and whatever leftovers he could find in his nearly empty refrigerator. The rain had started around 10, first as a gentle pattering against the windows, then building into a steady drumming that filled the quiet apartment with white noise. David actually liked the sound. It helped him focus and blocked out some of the building's usual creaks and groans. That's why he almost missed it at first. The soft click of his front door opening. David paused, his hand hovering over the laptop's trackpad. His building was old and the doors didn't always latch properly, especially when it was windy. Maybe the rain had loosened something. He waited, listening, but heard nothing else unusual. Then came the footsteps. They were soft, careful, like someone trying not to make noise. David's heart started beating faster. His landlord, Mr. Peterson, had a habit of doing surprise inspections, but never this late at night. And these footsteps sounded different, lighter, more deliberate. "Hello?" David called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mr. Peterson, is that you?" No answer. The footsteps continued down the short hallway that led to his bedroom. David slowly closed his laptop and stood up. The apartment suddenly felt much smaller than usual. He lived on the 4th floor, and there was no fire escape outside his windows. Whoever was in his apartment had come through the front door, which meant they either had a key or had picked the lock. His phone was charging in the bedroom, the same direction the footsteps had gone. David grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer, though he wasn't sure what good it would do. His hands were shaking slightly as he made his way toward the hallway. "Look, I don't have much money," he said, his voice echoing off the narrow walls. "But if you need something, we can talk about it." Still no response. David reached his bedroom doorway and stopped. Standing by his window with her back to him was a young woman. She had long dark hair that was soaked from the rain, and she wore a simple blue dress that clung to her frame. Water dripped steadily from her clothes onto his wooden floor, creating small puddles around her feet. In her right hand, she held a small brown suitcase that looked like it had seen better days. The leather was worn and scuffed, and one of the corners was held together with silver tape. David stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few seconds, trying to process what he was seeing. This wasn't a burglar. This wasn't his landlord. This was someone who looked lost, vulnerable, and completely out of place in his messy bedroom. The woman turned around slowly, and David got his first look at her face. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with dark eyes that seemed too large for her delicate features. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept properly in days. What struck him most was her expression. She looked at him with a mixture of fear and determination, like someone who had run out of options but was still trying to be brave. Her lips were pressed together in a thin line, and she held herself very still as if any sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile courage had brought her here. "Who are you?" David asked softly, setting down the flashlight. Something about her demeanor told him she wasn't dangerous. "How did you get in here?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she walked past him to the corner of his bedroom and set down her suitcase with careful precision. She opened it and pulled out a small towel, using it to wipe up the water she'd dripped on his floor. David watched in amazement as she continued this silent routine. She found his spare blankets in the closet. How did she know they were there? And created a neat little sleeping area by the window. She moved with quiet efficiency, as if she'd done this before, as if she had every right to be there. "Wait," David said, stepping forward. "You can't just... what's going on here? Are you in some kind of trouble?" She looked up at him then, and he saw something in her eyes that made him stop talking. It wasn't defiance exactly, but more like a quiet desperation. She reached into her suitcase and pulled out a small notebook and a pen. She wrote something quickly and tore out the page, handing it to him. The handwriting was neat and careful. "I need a safe place to stay for a few days. I won't cause any trouble. Please don't call the police." David read the note twice, then looked back at her. She was watching his face intently, as if trying to read his thoughts. The rain continued to pound against the windows, and somewhere in the building, a door slammed shut. "I don't even know your name," David said. She took the notebook back and wrote another line. "It's better if you don't." David sank down onto his bed, suddenly feeling exhausted. His logical mind was telling him to call the police or at least ask her to leave. You didn't just let strangers move into your apartment, especially strangers who wouldn't even tell you their names. But something else was holding him back. Maybe it was the way she'd cleaned up her own water without being asked. Maybe it was how small she looked standing there in his oversized room. Or maybe it was simply that David knew what it felt like to have nowhere else to go. After his father died 2 years ago, David had spent weeks feeling completely lost. He'd sat in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by condolence cards and casseroles from neighbors, feeling like a stranger in his own life. The loneliness had been overwhelming, and he remembered wishing that someone, anyone, would just sit with him without asking questions or trying to fix things. Looking at this mysterious woman, David recognized that same lost expression he'd seen in his own mirror during those dark months. "Okay," he said finally. "A few days, but I need to know if you're safe. I need to know you're not running from something that might follow you here." She wrote one more note and handed it to him. "I'm safe as long as I stay invisible." David folded the note and put it in his pocket. Outside, the rain was beginning to slow, but the wind was picking up, rattling the old windows. The woman had arranged her makeshift bed and was now sitting on the blankets, hugging her knees to her chest. "Are you hungry?" David asked. She shook her head, but her stomach chose that moment to growl loudly. Despite everything, David almost smiled. "I'll make some soup," he said. "It's not much, but it's warm." As he left the room to head back to the kitchen, David wondered what he was getting himself into. 3 hours ago, his biggest worry had been finishing a logo design. Now he was sharing his apartment with a complete stranger who communicated only in handwritten notes. But as he heated up a can of soup and listened to the quiet sounds of her settling in, David realized that for the first time in months, his apartment didn't feel quite so empty. He had no idea that this mysterious woman would change his life in ways he couldn't imagine. He had no idea that her silence would teach him things about communication he'd never understood, and he definitely had no idea that in just a few weeks, he'd be grateful for that rainy Tuesday night when she slipped into his room and refused to leave. All David knew was that something significant had just begun. The first morning was awkward in ways David hadn't expected. He woke up at his usual time, 7:30, and for a moment forgot that someone else was in his apartment. Then he heard the soft sounds of movement from his bedroom and remembered everything. The mysterious woman had already folded her blankets into a neat pile and was sitting by the window, writing in her notebook. She'd changed out of the wet dress from the night before and was now wearing jeans and a plain sweater that looked too big for her small frame. David stood in his doorway, unsure of how to handle this situation. Did he say good morning? Did he pretend she wasn't there? Did he offer her breakfast? She solved the problem for him by holding up a piece of paper with "thank you" written in her careful handwriting. "You're welcome," David replied, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was being thanked for. Over the next few days, they developed an odd routine that somehow worked. The woman, David had started thinking of her as his mysterious guest, was incredibly considerate. She used the bathroom only when David wasn't around, kept her belongings neatly contained to one corner of his bedroom, and moved through the apartment like a ghost. David would leave for client meetings or coffee shop work sessions, and when he returned, he'd find small signs that she'd been active. A clean coffee cup in the dish rack that he didn't remember using. The living room tidier than he'd left it. Once he came home to find a sandwich waiting for him on the kitchen counter, made with ingredients he definitely hadn't had that morning. She must have gone out to buy groceries, but David never saw her leave or return. It was like living with a helpful spirit who only appeared when he wasn't looking. The communication through notes became their normal way of interacting. David would write questions. Do you need anything from the store? Or is the apartment too cold? And leave them on the kitchen counter. She would respond with simple answers, usually just no thank you or I'm fine. But David was starting to notice things about his mysterious guest that her notes didn't reveal. She was an early riser who spent long periods sitting by the window, watching the street below with intense focus. She never seemed to relax completely. Even when she appeared to be resting, there was a tension in her shoulders that suggested she was ready to move quickly if needed. Most intriguingly, she was always drawing. David caught glimpses of her notebook when she left it open on his kitchen table. The sketches were incredible. Detailed drawings of buildings, faces, hands, random objects around his apartment. She had real talent, the kind that came from years of training and practice. On the fourth day, David worked up the courage to leave a longer note. Your drawings are amazing. Are you an artist? Her response was waiting for him that evening. I used to be. Something about those 4 words made David's chest tight. There was so much sadness packed into such a simple sentence. The breakthrough came on day 6, completely by accident. David was struggling with a particularly difficult project, a company logo that needed to convey both tradition and innovation, which was basically designer code for impossible. He'd been staring at his laptop screen for 3 hours, creating version after version that just didn't work. He was muttering to himself, frustrated and running out of time when he heard a soft voice behind him say, "The font is fighting with the image." David spun around so quickly he nearly knocked over his coffee. His mysterious guest was standing behind his chair, looking at his screen with professional interest. It was the first time she'd spoken aloud since that first night. Her voice was softer than he'd imagined, with a slight accent he couldn't quite place. But what surprised him more was that she was right. The font he'd chosen was competing with the logo design instead of complementing it. You think so? David asked carefully, not wanting to scare her back into silence. She nodded and pointed to the screen. The curves in the font are too similar to the curves in the image. They're canceling each other out instead of working together. David made the change she suggested, switching to a cleaner, more geometric font. Immediately the design clicked into place. That's perfect, he breathed. How did you see that? She shrugged, looking suddenly uncomfortable with the attention. I studied design in college before. She trailed off and David didn't push. But something had shifted between them. The wall of silence was developing its first crack. Over the following days, their interactions gradually expanded. She would offer small suggestions when David was working. Always hesitant at first, then more confident when she saw he genuinely valued her input. She had an incredible eye for color and composition, and her suggestions consistently improved his designs. David learned that she preferred tea to coffee, that she was left-handed, and that she had a habit of humming very quietly when she thought no one was listening. She learned that David worked better with background noise, that he had a tendency to skip meals when he was focused, and that he talked to himself when he was problem-solving. The apartment began to feel less like David's space with a mysterious guest and more like a shared home. She started leaving notes with observations about his work or questions about design techniques. David started leaving books about art and design where she could find them, and was pleased to discover them moved around the apartment as she read them. But it wasn't until the second week that David realized how much he was starting to look forward to coming home. He'd spent the day at a coffee shop working on a project, and as he climbed the stairs to his apartment, he found himself walking faster. He was eager to see what she'd been drawing, whether she'd left any notes, what subtle improvements she might have made to his living space. When he opened his door, the apartment was filled with an amazing smell. She was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove. She looked up when he entered, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she smiled. I found a recipe online, she said quietly. I hope you don't mind that I used your computer. David looked around his kitchen in amazement. She'd somehow transformed his basic ingredients into what looked and smelled like a gourmet meal. The small table was set with his mismatched plates and the one candle he owned, creating an atmosphere that was both simple and elegant. "Mine, this is incredible," David said. "But you didn't have to." "I wanted to," she interrupted softly. "You've been so kind to me. I wanted to do something nice for you." They sat down to eat together, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the silence between them felt comfortable rather than mysterious. David found himself stealing glances at her as they ate. Without the wariness that had marked her first days in his apartment, she looked younger, more relaxed. "Can I ask you something?" David said as they finished eating. She tensed slightly but nodded. "What made you choose my apartment? Out of all the places you could have gone, why here?" She was quiet for so long that David thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, "I watched you for a few days before I came up, through the coffee shop window across the street. You always looked like you were working on something important, something you cared about, and you never looked angry even when things weren't going well." David felt a strange warmth in his chest. "You were looking for someone who wouldn't be angry." She nodded, not meeting his eyes. "I needed to find someone safe." The word safe hung between them, carrying implications that David didn't fully understand but could feel the weight of. Whatever had happened to her, whoever she was running from, it had something to do with not feeling safe. That night, as David got ready for bed, he realized that his mysterious guest had been right about more than just font choices. She'd been right about him being safe, but what she probably didn't realize was that he'd been looking for something too, even if he hadn't known it. For months after his father's death, David had been going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. He'd convinced himself that he was fine, that he was handling everything well. But having her there, seeing his life through someone else's eyes, had shown him how lonely he'd actually been. Her quiet presence had brought something back to his apartment that he'd been missing. The sense that it was a home, rather than just a place where he slept and worked. As David drifted off to sleep that night, he found himself hoping that whatever she was running from would stay far away. He wasn't ready for her to leave yet. He had no idea that she was lying awake in the next room, thinking the exact same thing. 3 weeks had passed since that rainy Tuesday night, and David's life had settled into a rhythm he never could have imagined. His mysterious guest, who had finally told him her name was Maya, had become an essential part of his daily routine. Not in an overwhelming way, but in the quiet, comfortable way that good friendships develop over time. Maya had slowly begun speaking more, though she was still careful with her words. David learned that she had grown up in a small town about 2 hours away, that she loved old movies from the 1940s, and that she could make amazing meals out of almost nothing. She learned that David had lost his father recently, that he sometimes stayed up too late working because he was afraid of failing, and that he had a terrible habit of forgetting to eat when he was stressed. The apartment had transformed too. Maya had a gift for making spaces feel warmer and more welcoming. She'd rearranged David's furniture in subtle ways that made the rooms feel bigger and more organized. She'd found inexpensive plants at the corner market and placed them around the apartment, bringing life to spaces that had felt sterile before. But the biggest change was in David's work. Having Maya there to bounce ideas off had improved his designs dramatically. She had an intuitive understanding of visual balance and color theory that complemented his technical skills perfectly. What used to take him hours to figure out, they could solve together in minutes. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything shifted again. David was working on a particularly complex project, a complete brand identity for a small restaurant, when he hit a creative wall. He'd been staring at the same design for 2 hours, making tiny adjustments that didn't really improve anything. Maya was sitting at the other end of the kitchen table, sketching in her notebook as usual. She looked up when David groaned in frustration and pushed back from his laptop. "What if you're thinking about it wrong?" she said quietly. David looked at her, interested. "What do you mean?" "You're designing for a restaurant, but you're thinking like a designer. What if you thought like a customer instead?" She moved her chair closer to his laptop and pointed at the screen. "This logo is beautiful, very professional. But when I look at it, I don't feel hungry. I don't feel like I'm going to have a good time." David studied his design with fresh eyes. She was right. It was technically perfect, but emotionally cold. "So what would make you feel hungry?" he asked. Maya smiled, and David realized it was becoming easier to make her smile lately. Tell me about the restaurant. What kind of place is it? David pulled up his notes from the client meeting. It's family-owned, been around for 30 years. The owner's grandmother started it, and they still use her recipes. The food is simple but really good. Comfort food, nothing fancy. And what does the place look like? Small, maybe 15 tables. Mismatched chairs. Photos of the family on the walls. The kind of place where the owner remembers your usual order. Maya nodded thoughtfully. So why does their logo look like it belongs on a corporate building instead of on a family restaurant? David stared at the screen, seeing his work completely differently. Because I was designing what I thought looked professional instead of what felt right for them. Exactly, Maya said. Design should tell a story. What story does this family want to tell? For the next 3 hours, they worked together to completely reimagine the project. Maya sketched while David worked on the computer, and together they created something that felt warm and inviting instead of cold and corporate. They used colors that reminded people of home-cooked meals, fonts that felt handwritten rather than printed, and images that suggested comfort rather than sophistication. When they finally finished, David leaned back in his chair and looked at what they'd created. It was completely different from his original design, and it was absolutely perfect. Maya, this is incredible, he said. You should be doing this professionally. You're better at this than half the designers I know. Maya's smile faded slightly. I used to do this professionally, she said quietly. David sensed there was more to the story, but he'd learned not to push. Instead, he saved their work and closed the laptop. Well, you're doing it now, and you're amazing at it. That evening, as they sat on the couch watching an old movie, Maya spoke up during a quiet scene. I was a teaching assistant at the community college, she said without looking at him. I taught basic design classes while I was working on my master's degree. David muted the television and turned to face her. This was the most she'd ever shared about her past. I loved it, Maya continued. Teaching, I mean. There's something magical about watching someone understand a concept for the first time, when their face lights up because they finally get how color theory works, or why certain fonts make you feel different emotions. What happened? David asked gently. Maya was quiet for a long moment. I was dating someone, another graduate student. At first, he seemed supportive of my work. He'd come to my classes sometimes, said he was proud of me. David felt a knot forming in his stomach. He could tell from her tone that this story wasn't going to have a happy ending. But gradually he started changing. He began criticizing my teaching, saying I was spending too much time at school. He wanted to know where I was every minute of the day. He'd show up at my office unexpectedly, checking on me. Maya pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself smaller. I thought it was because he cared about me. I didn't recognize it as controlling behavior at first. David wanted to reach out and comfort her, but something in her posture told him to give her space to tell her story. It got worse over the months. He started following me to work, calling me constantly when I was teaching. He convinced me to stop spending time with my friends, said they were a bad influence. He made me feel like I couldn't do anything right without his approval. Maya, David said softly, that's not love. That's abuse. She nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. I know that now. But when you're in the middle of it, when someone is constantly telling you that you're wrong about everything, you start to believe it. What finally made you leave? Maya wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I found out he'd been tracking my phone. He knew everywhere I went, everyone I talked to. And he'd been calling my supervisor at school, telling him I was unreliable, trying to get me fired. David felt anger building in his chest. How could someone do that to another person? Especially someone as gentle and talented as Maya. The last straw was when I came home one day and found him going through my computer, reading my emails and looking at my class materials. When I confronted him, he said it was because he cared about me, because he was trying to protect me from making mistakes. Maya looked at David then, and he saw pain in her eyes that went deeper than he'd imagined. I realized that if I stayed, I was going to disappear completely. He was erasing me piece by piece, my friendships, my career, my confidence, my sense of reality. I packed one bag and left that night. And you came here, David said. I drove around for hours trying to figure out where to go. I couldn't go home to my family. He knew where they lived. I couldn't go to friends because I'd pushed them all away. I ended up parked across from this building watching people come and go. Maya managed a small smile. I saw you through the coffee shop window working on your laptop. You looked so focused, so peaceful. And when things went wrong with your computer, you didn't get angry or throw things. You just took a deep breath and tried a different approach. So you decided I was safe. I decided you were kind, Maya corrected. There's a difference. I'd forgotten that kind people existed. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the television still muted, the old movie playing out its drama without sound. I'm glad you found me, David said eventually. These past few weeks, you've changed my life, Maya. You've made everything better. Maya looked at him with surprise. I've been hiding in your apartment, eating your food, taking up your space. How have I made anything better? David thought about how to explain it. Before you came here, I was just existing, going through the motions. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. I was lonely, but I'd convinced myself I was fine. He gestured around the apartment. Look at this place now. It feels like a home instead of just somewhere I keep my stuff. And my work is better than it's ever been because I have someone to share ideas with. But more than that, David continued, you've reminded me what it feels like to care about someone else's well-being. For months after my dad died, I felt numb to everything. But worrying about whether you're okay, wanting to make sure you feel safe here, it's brought something back to life in me that I thought was gone forever. Maya was crying again, but this time her tears looked different, less painful, more hopeful. I was so scared when I showed up here, she admitted. I thought I'd lost everything, my career, my confidence, my ability to trust my own judgment. But these weeks with you have shown me that I'm still me underneath all the fear. David reached out carefully and took her hand. She didn't pull away. You are definitely still you, he said. And you're incredible. The person who hurt you tried to convince you otherwise, but he was wrong about everything. Maya squeezed his hand. Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself. As they sat there together, hands intertwined, 2 months had passed since Maya's arrival, and their life together had settled into something that felt natural and right. David's work was thriving thanks to their collaboration, and Maya was slowly building back her confidence. She'd even started sketching again, not just idle doodles, but real artistic pieces that showed the depth of her talent. Then everything changed on a cold December morning, when David received a phone call that would test everything they'd built together. David, this is incredible news, his client Rachel was saying on the other end of the line. The restaurant project you did for us has caught the attention of a major hotel chain. They want to hire you to redesign the branding for 12 of their properties. David nearly dropped his coffee cup. This was the kind of contract that could change his entire financial situation. That's amazing, Rachel. What's the timeline? Here's the thing, Rachel continued. They want you to work on site with their team in Chicago for 6 weeks. It's a rush job, but the pay is substantial. I'm talking about enough money to set you up for the next 2 years. David looked across the kitchen table at Maya, who was reading a design magazine while eating her breakfast. She looked up when she noticed his expression, raising her eyebrows in question. When would I need to start? David asked. Next Monday. I know it's short notice, but they're willing to pay a premium for the quick turnaround. Plus, they're covering all your expenses, hotel, meals, everything. David's mind raced. This was exactly the kind of opportunity he'd been hoping for. The break that could establish him as more than just a freelancer scrambling for small projects. But the thought of leaving Maya alone in the apartment made his stomach clench with worry. After he hung up, Maya looked at him expectantly. Good news? David explained the situation, watching Maya's face carefully as he spoke. She listened without interrupting, nodding at appropriate moments, but he could see something shifting in her expression. That's wonderful, David, she said when he finished. This is exactly what you've been working toward. But I'd have to leave for 6 weeks, David said. I can't ask you to stay here alone for that long. What if your ex tries to find you? What if something happens? Maya set down her magazine and gave him a small smile. I've been thinking about that anyway. It's probably time for me to find my own place. You've done more than enough for me. David felt a panic he wasn't prepared for. Maya, no. I don't want you to leave. These past 2 months have been the best I've felt in years. I'm worried about leaving you. I'll be fine, Maya said, but David could hear something forced in her tone. This is a huge opportunity for you. You can't turn it down because of me. They spent the rest of the day dancing around the real issue. David called Rachel back twice, trying to negotiate a way to do the work remotely. Maya began looking at apartment listings online. making notes about places she could afford with her small savings. That evening, as they sat at opposite ends of the couch pretending to watch television, the tension between them was impossible to ignore. "Talk to me," David said, finally muting the TV. "What are you really thinking?" Maya was quiet for a long moment. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not just about being alone, but about what happens when you come back." "What do you mean?" "David, look at what we've built here. We work together. We eat together. We spend every evening together. We've become—" She paused, struggling for the right words. "We've become something that isn't just friendship, but we've never talked about what that means." David felt his heart start beating faster. They had been dancing around this topic for weeks, both of them clearly feeling something deeper than friendship, but neither wanting to be the first to acknowledge it. "You're right," David said. "We have become something more." Maya looked at him then, and he saw vulnerability in her eyes that went deeper than anything she'd shared before. "I care about you, David. More than I should, considering everything that's happened to me. And that terrifies me. Why does it terrify you? Because the last time I cared about someone, I lost myself completely. I gave up my friends, my confidence, my career, my sense of reality. I became someone I didn't recognize." David moved closer to her on the couch. "Maya, what we have isn't anything like what you had with him. You know that, right?" "In my head, I know that," Maya said. "But in my heart, I'm scared that caring about someone means becoming weak again. That if I let myself love you, I'll lose who I am." David felt the weight of her words. She hadn't said she loved him exactly, but she'd come close enough that his chest felt tight with emotion. "Can I tell you what I see when I look at you?" David asked. "I see someone who survived something terrible and came out stronger. I see someone who took a huge risk by trusting a stranger and it paid off. I see someone who has made my life better in every possible way." Maya's eyes filled with tears. "But what if I'm not as strong as you think I am? What if being apart for 6 weeks makes me realize I'm too damaged for this?" David reached out and took her hands. "Maya, you're not damaged. You're healing. There's a difference." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've watched you heal over these 2 months. I've seen you go from someone who was afraid to speak out loud to someone who challenges my ideas and makes them better. I've watched you transform this apartment from a place I existed into a place I actually live." David paused, gathering his courage. "And I've fallen in love with who you are. Not who you might become, not who you used to be, but exactly who you are right now." Maya stared at him, tears flowing freely now. "David, I'm in love with your kindness and your talent and your strength. I'm in love with the way you make coffee in the morning and how you hum when you're drawing. I'm in love with your laugh and your insights about design and the way you've made me want to be a better person." Maya was crying harder now, but she was also smiling. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been trying not to, but I love you so much it scares me." David felt like his heart might explode from relief and joy. "Then don't let fear make this decision for us. Come with me to Chicago." Maya blinked in surprise. "What? Come with me? We'll find a place to stay together. You can work on your own projects while I'm dealing with the hotel people. We can explore the city together in the evenings." "David, I can afford it," David interrupted. "This contract pays enough to cover both of us, and honestly, my work is better when you're involved anyway. Think of it as a business partnership." Maya laughed through her tears. "A business partnership?" "Among other things," David said, moving even closer to her. "Maya, I don't want to do this without you. Not the work, not the trip, not any of it. These past 2 months have shown me what my life could be like with the right person in it." Maya looked at him for a long moment, and David could practically see her internal struggle. Fear warring with hope, past trauma fighting against present love. "What if it doesn't work?" she asked quietly. "What if we're too different, or what if being together all the time ruins what we have?" "What if it does work?" David countered. "What if we're perfect together and this is just the beginning of something amazing?" Maya smiled then, the first genuinely happy smile he'd seen from her since that morning's phone call. "You really want me to come with you?" "I really want you to come with me," David confirmed. "Not because I think you need me to take care of you, but because I think we take care of each other." Maya nodded slowly. "Okay, yes, I want to come with you." David felt a rush of happiness unlike anything he'd experienced before. "Really? Really," Maya said. "I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of letting what happened to me control what happens next." David leaned forward and kissed her then, soft and gentle, their first kiss after months of careful friendship and growing attraction. Maya kissed him back, and David could taste the salt of her tears mixed with something sweeter, hope. When they broke apart, Maya rested her forehead against his. "I can't promise I won't be scared sometimes," she said. "I can't promise I won't need reassurance that this is real and good." "I can't promise I won't mess up sometimes," David replied. "I can't promise I'll always know the right thing to say or do." "But we can promise to be honest with each other," Maya said, "and to face whatever comes next together." "Together," David agreed. That night, for the first time since she'd arrived, Maya didn't sleep by the window or on the couch. She fell asleep in David's arms, finally feeling safe enough to let down her last remaining guard, and David fell asleep holding her, amazed that the mysterious woman who had slipped into his room 3 months ago had become the love of his life. They had no idea that Chicago would bring challenges neither of them expected. They had no idea that their relationship would be tested in ways that would force them both to grow. But they were no longer facing the future as two separate, wounded people trying to heal alone. They were facing it together, and that made all the difference. Chicago was everything David had hoped it would be, and more challenging than either of them had expected. The hotel project was massive, requiring David to work closely with teams of architects, interior designers, and marketing specialists. The pressure was intense, but having Maya by his side made all the difference. They'd found a small furnished apartment near downtown for the 6 weeks. Nothing fancy but comfortable enough for their temporary stay. Maya had been nervous about the move at first, worried about being in a new city where she didn't know anyone. But Chicago turned out to be exactly what she needed. For the first time in over a year, Maya felt truly anonymous. In their old city, she'd always been looking over her shoulder, worried that her ex might find her. But Chicago was huge, bustling with millions of people, and she could walk down the street without fear. The city's energy seemed to wake something up in her that had been sleeping for too long. While David worked during the day, Maya explored. She visited art museums, sat in coffee shops sketching the people around her, and walked through neighborhoods she'd never seen before. She started carrying a larger sketchbook and filled page after page with drawings of the city, the architecture, the lake, the way light fell across buildings at different times of day. But the best part of each day was when David came home. They'd cook dinner together in their tiny kitchen, talking about their days. David would tell her about the challenges at work, and Maya would share what she'd discovered in the city. Their conversations flowed easily, naturally, like they'd been together for years instead of months. The hotel project was going well, but it was demanding. David was working longer hours than he ever had, and some days he came home exhausted and stressed. Maya learned to read his moods, knowing when he needed to talk through problems and when he just needed quiet companionship. One particularly difficult evening, 3 weeks into their stay, David came home looking defeated. The hotel executives had rejected his third design concept, saying it wasn't innovative enough while also being too modern for their brand. David felt like he was chasing an impossible target. "I don't know what they want," he said, slumping into a chair at their small kitchen table. "Every time I think I understand their vision, they change direction." Maya set down her sketchbook and moved to the chair beside him. "Show me what you've been working on." David pulled out his laptop and showed her the latest designs. They were good, professional, clean, sophisticated, but as Maya studied them, she could see why the clients were struggling. "These are beautiful," she said carefully, "but they don't tell a story." "What do you mean?" Maya thought for a moment. "What makes their hotels special? What's different about staying there versus staying at any other hotel chain?" David scrolled through his notes from the client meetings. They emphasize personal service, local connections, making guests feel at home even when they're traveling. "But none of that comes through in these designs," Maya said gently. "These could be for any upscale hotel anywhere in the world." David stared at his screen with fresh eyes. She was right, but he wasn't sure how to fix it. "What if we went to see one of their hotels?" Maya suggested. "Not to work, just to experience what it's like to be a guest there." The next day was Saturday, so they visited the hotel chain's flagship location downtown. Maya had convinced David to approach it like regular travelers, not as the designer working on their rebrand. They had coffee in the lobby, walked around the public spaces, talked to the staff. Maya noticed things David had missed in all his meetings with executives. The way the doorman remembered return guests' names. How the lobby furniture was arranged to encourage conversation between strangers. The local artwork on the walls that changed depending on which city you were in. This is what makes them different, Maya said as they sat in the hotel's restaurant. It's not about luxury or innovation. It's about connection. They make people feel like they belong somewhere even when they're far from home. David felt something click into place. So the branding should feel like that too. Welcoming, personal, connected to place. Exactly, Maya said. Instead of trying to look like the most expensive hotel in the city, they should look like the hotel that makes you feel most at home. They spent the rest of the weekend completely reimagining the project. David handled the technical aspects while Maya focused on the emotional story they wanted to tell. They created mood boards, color palettes, and design concepts that felt warm and inviting rather than cold and impressive. Monday morning, David presented their new approach to the hotel executives. The change in their response was immediate and dramatic. For the first time in weeks, they seemed excited about what they were seeing. "This is it," the head of marketing said, leaning forward in her chair. "This is exactly what our brand should feel like." The project that had been struggling for weeks suddenly came together beautifully. David and Maya worked as a perfect team, each bringing skills that complemented the others perfectly. David's technical expertise combined with Maya's artistic intuition created work that neither could have achieved alone. But more than just professional success, their time in Chicago was healing something deeper in their relationship. Away from the apartment where Maya had first arrived as a frightened stranger, they were able to be themselves completely. They were no longer David helping Maya or Maya hiding from her past. They were simply two people building a life together. Maya started talking about her future in ways she hadn't since college. She mentioned wanting to teach again someday, maybe starting with community workshops for people interested in art and design. David encouraged these dreams, helping her research programs and opportunities. David, meanwhile, discovered that having a true creative partner made his work more fulfilling than it had ever been. He'd always thought of himself as someone who worked better alone, but collaborating with Maya brought out ideas and insights he never would have found on his own. 3 weeks before the project was scheduled to end, David received another surprise phone call. The hotel executives were so pleased with their work that they wanted to offer him a permanent position as their creative director. It would mean moving to Chicago permanently, with a salary that would provide financial security for both of them. That evening, as they walked along Lake Michigan watching the sunset, David told Maya about the offer. "What do you think?" he asked. "Would you want to stay here? Make Chicago our home?" Maya stopped walking and turned to face the lake. The water stretched out endlessly in front of them, reflecting the colors of the sky. "A year ago, I couldn't imagine having a home anywhere," she said. "I felt like I was running from everything, like I'd never be safe enough to put down roots." She turned to look at David. "But home isn't really about a place, is it? It's about the people you're with, the life you build together." David took her hand. "So that's a yes?" Maya smiled, the kind of smile that started small and grew until it took over her whole face. "That's a yes. Let's build our life here." The remaining weeks flew by in a blur of apartment hunting, job applications for Maya, and finalizing the hotel project. They found a wonderful place in a neighborhood full of artists and young professionals, with big windows and space for both of them to work. Maya connected with a local community center that offered art classes for adults. They were looking for someone to teach basic design principles, and Maya's combination of formal training and real-world experience made her a perfect fit. On their last day in the temporary apartment, they packed their belongings, which had somehow doubled during their stay in Chicago. Maya had filled 2 new sketchbooks and bought art supplies she hadn't touched in years. David had a portfolio of work he was prouder of than anything he'd ever created. As they loaded the last box into their car, Maya found herself thinking about that rainy night 8 months ago, when she'd first slipped into David's apartment. She'd been running from everything. Her ex, her fears, her own sense of worthlessness. She'd thought she was looking for a place to hide. "What are you thinking about?" David asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "Just how different everything is now," Maya said. "When I first came to your apartment, I thought I was broken. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered." David put his arm around her shoulders. "And now? Now I know I wasn't broken, just lost. And sometimes getting lost is the only way to find where you really belong." They drove to their new apartment together, past the lake where they'd made the decision to stay, past the hotel where they'd learned to work as true partners, past the coffee shops and museums that had helped Maya remember who she was beneath all the fear. As they carried their boxes up to their new home, Maya realized something that made her smile. She was no longer the mysterious woman who had appeared in David's room without explanation. She was no longer hiding or running or trying to disappear. She was Maya, artist and teacher and partner and friend. She was someone who had survived something terrible and used that experience to build something beautiful. She was someone who had learned that love didn't have to mean losing yourself. It could mean finding yourself more completely than ever before, and David was no longer the lonely man going through the motions of life. He was someone who had opened his door to a stranger and discovered